In a series of videos and interviews, Dr. Lawrence Krauss compares creationists to groups like the Taliban and calls teaching creationism to children child abuse.
He apparently wants to censor any science that contradicts his atheistic beliefs. And of course that means promoting the idea of evolution occurring over millions of years above all else, because all atheists have to explain away how they got here without God, and so they have to believe in evolution.
Yeah. After making several statements in an interview on the David Pakman Show, which we'll address shortly, the host cuts to what we think is the heart of the discussion about whether teaching creation or evolution is good or bad, and asks Krauss, who ultimately gets to decide whether something is good or bad? Who gets to decide what will be taught to children?
Well, Lawrence tries to dance around, stating that we need to educate people, and although you don't want the state to control you on all levels, society has an obligation to protect kids and ensure kids get the best medicine, health care, education, etc.
Well, he's dodging the point. We, well, who exactly is we? And with what information should we educate them? Whose standard of truth are we going to impose on our kids? Does the state decide, or do parents decide?
He says parents do have power over their children, but we should be careful not to allow parents to remove their kids from schools. Well, what schools? On what grounds? How do you decide if a school is good or bad? Who gets to determine what a bad school is based on what set of morals and ethics? When he says we, what he means is the state, and he means parents shouldn't have the right to homeschool.
Yeah, he says kids should believe what scientists say, but does that include creation scientists with PhDs as well? Nope. Because of his strongly held belief in evolution, he thinks there isn't any evidence against it. On the other hand, at Creation Ministries International, we strongly believe that God created. However, unlike Dr. Krauss and many other atheists, we're not suggesting the censoring of the teaching of evolution. In fact, quite the opposite. We encourage Christian parents and Christian teachers to teach students, teach their kids about evolution. One of the main reasons we don't fear doing this is that by simply teaching students good science and fostering some critical thinking skills, many students are going to see that evolution is unscientific nonsense.
You see, ultimately what Lawrence and friends of his like Richard Dawkins are saying is that they want their worldview to be taught exclusively, and all other information either censored or taught as myths. I mean, if you teach your kids that a frog turned into a prince with a kiss, that's considered a fairy tale. But if you add unseen millions of years, it's considered science.
Wow.
Is that really what we want to be teaching our kids?
Lawrence likes to say that teaching kids, for example, about hell is child abuse. And this, of course, originates from his faulty belief that hell doesn't exist. But don't we all teach our kids that there are consequences to their actions and behavior in this life? For example, don't touch the stove. Look both ways before you cross the street. Don't eat 5 pounds of chocolate before you go to bed. Whatever. A great deal of what is taught to children is because we don't want them to reap the negative consequences of poor choices. What you believe has consequences, and sometimes they're immediate, sometimes they show up later in life, and sometimes the consequences show up just after you die, when everyone will be held accountable for what they believe and how they've acted based on their beliefs. That's right. Not only children, but everyone needs to understand that if they do something wrong, they're going to be held accountable. Well, guess what? We've all done wrong things. We're all in the same boat here. And we will all be held accountable to God after our deaths because of our sin toward Him. Now, thankfully, there's a way to be saved from God's judgment. And atheists love to talk about God's judgment. Well, there's a way to be saved from that judgment because of what the Lord Jesus has done. But those who spurn God's forgiveness will suffer God's wrath. So shouldn't we as Christians be warning people about how they can be saved from that coming judgment? It would be extremely unloving not to tell others that the consequences of wrong beliefs about God is hell. Deliberately rejecting the mountains of evidence for the biblical God and His Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, quite obviously leads to a wrong belief about God.
Lawrence tries to equate believing in God to believing in Santa Claus, who isn't real. It would be far more accurate to equate believing in evolution with believing in Santa Claus. I mean, some people tell kids there's this magical force that does wonderful things, but you can't observe it. For example, no one's observed one kind of creature turning into another, like a lizard turning into a bird, for example. If you believe that happened, you believe it on faith. I mean, you can tell kids there's a magical force called evolution that made everything if you want to. But as Lawrence's friend, Richard Dawkins, has admitted, evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed when it's happening.
So no one has observed evolution, as Dawkins just admitted, and no one has observed Santa Claus. You know why? Because neither one exists. Atheist University of Chicago evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne had a Santa Claus realization about the famous peppered moths that have appeared in textbooks for many, many years. Some evolutionists called the peppered moth example the prize horse in our stable. It was a major evidence for evolution. Now, he says when he found out that the peppered moth story had to be thrown out because of its lack of credibility, and that's quite recent actually, he says that realization gave him the same feelings as when he found out that Santa Claus wasn't real.
And Lawrence repeatedly states that teaching creation will hinder children from reaching their full potential as contributing members of our society.
Okay.
But potential for what?
Yeah.
It's not going to hinder them scientifically. Some of the greatest scientists of all time were creationists.
Right.
But consider what makes a good citizen. Most people recognize that kindness and service to others is a hallmark of a good citizen. Now, which belief system, atheism or Christianity, produces better citizens?
Yeah, well, here's where we can actually refer to an atheist on this subject. British politician and author Roy Hattersley, here's what he had to say about the Christian group, the Salvation Army. It remains a vibrant organization because of its convictions. I'm an atheist, but I can look with amazement at the devotion of the Salvation Army workers. I've been out with them on the streets, and the way they work amongst the people, the most deprived and disadvantaged, and sometimes pretty repugnant characters. I don't believe they would do that if it were not for the religious impulse. And I often say, I never hear of atheist organizations taking food to the poor. You don't hear of atheist aid, rather like Christian aid. And I think despite my inability to believe for myself, I'm deeply impressed by what belief does for people like the Salvation Army. Well, here's a good example of where beliefs have consequences.
Exactly.
Christians believe that people are made in God's image and are therefore valuable, not just evolved pond scum.
Exactly. Lawrence repeatedly states that we shouldn't withhold information from children. Well, we agree.
Okay.
They should be taught the scientific and historical evidences for creation instead of having that information suppressed and ridiculed so that they can make up their own mind about the question of origins.
Right, yeah, and maybe before people buy into some sort of like state-mandated, thought-policed system of atheistic indoctrination, people need to think more deeply about what kind of world we would be living in without the influence of God and His people.
Right.
The world would be very, very different. And for more details on this and some of the other topics we've talked about here and in the first two programs, have a look at some of the articles we've linked to in this video's description.
Right.
If you're an atheist, we challenge you to honestly evaluate the evidence against your position.
Right. As always at Creation Ministries International, we advocate the teaching of science and truth. And truth will always offend anyone who clings to error, so don't be offended.